It was a bright afternoon, and the city bustled with its usual energy. Cars honking, people hurrying down sidewalks, and conversations buzzing through the air. Amid this hum of activity, one moment stood out, quietly brewing inside the grand foyer of an upscale hotel. The kind of place where sparkling chandeliers hum from vaulted ceilings and the marble floors seemed to shine endlessly. It was a space meant to exude luxury and comfort, but for one elderly woman, it would become the stage for a humiliating and unjust ordeal she would never forget. Her name was Mrs. Eleanor Grant, a gentle soul in her 70s with soft grey curls and an ever-present warmth in her eyes. Eleanor had spent most of her life as a school teacher, shaping young minds and making a difference in her community. She wasn't the kind of person who demanded attention or stirred up trouble. Her presence was quiet, yet deeply respectable. On this particular day, she had stopped by the hotel simply to enjoy an afternoon tea, a rare treat for herself after years of putting everyone else first. She wore a neatly pressed blue dress, her favorite, and clutched her modest handbag, unaware of the storm that was about to upend her quiet afternoon. Eleanor had barely settled into a corner seat when the atmosphere began to shift. She noticed it first in the way the staff glanced in her direction, fleeting, suspicious looks that she had grown accustomed to, but never quite accepted. Being a black woman, even at her age, she knew what those looks often meant. Still, she tried to brush it off, focusing instead on the sweet aroma of the tea being served and the pleasant murmur of conversation around her. After all, she had done nothing wrong. Why would anyone think otherwise? But just as the waiter approached her table with her tea, two hotel security guards appeared beside her. Their towering frames and stern expressions immediately drew the attention of the other guests. Eleanor's heart sank as they addressed her with cold, accusatory voices. They claimed an expensive bracelet had gone missing from the hotel's gift shop, and that she was the prime suspect. At first, Eleanor thought there must be some mistake. She explained calmly, her voice trembling only slightly, that she had done nothing of the sort. She hadn't even been near the gift shop. But her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The guards weren't interested in her explanation. They demanded to see her belongings, their tone growing harsher with each passing second. The room seemed to freeze as other guests stopped what they were doing to watch the scene unfold. Eleanor's cheeks burned with shame, and she felt the weight of dozens of eyes judging her. The very place that promised luxury and hospitality had turned into a source of humiliation and fear. When Eleanor hesitated, clutching her bag tightly, the guards grew impatient. "If you have nothing to hide, you'll show us what's inside," one of them said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the tense silence. Eleanor, feeling cornered and powerless, opened her bag with shaking hands. It contained nothing but her wallet, a small notebook, and a few personal items, nothing that could even remotely resemble a stolen bracelet. But that didn't stop the guards from continuing their accusations. Before she knew it, they were escorting her out of the hotel, their grip on her arms firm despite her protests. The humiliation was unbearable. She tried to hold her head high, but the shame and anger were too heavy to bear. As they dragged her toward the grand double doors, Eleanor couldn't help but wonder how things had escalated so quickly. What had she done to deserve this treatment? Why wouldn't anyone listen to her? Outside the hotel, Eleanor stood on the sidewalk, her breath coming in short, shaky bursts. She felt stripped of her dignity, reduced to nothing more than a spectacle for passers-by. People stared but said nothing, their faces a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. The hotel staff had already turned their backs on her, retreating into the safety of the grand building, as if erasing her from their pristine image. Eleanor clenched her fists, her heart pounding with a mix of frustration and sadness. But then, just as she thought the ordeal couldn't get any worse, her phone buzzed in her bag. With trembling hands, she retrieved it and saw her son's name flashing on the screen. Her son, David, was a man of quiet strength and unwavering determination. He had always been her protector, her rock, ever since his father had passed away years ago. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether she wanted to burden him with what had just happened. But as the tears welled up in her eyes, she realized she had no choice. When David picked up, his voice was calm and steady, as always. "Hi, Mom. What's wrong?" he asked, immediately sensing the distress in her silence. Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to steady her voice, and began to recount what had just happened. With each word, her voice grew shakier, and by the time she finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, David spoke, and there was a quiet intensity in his tone that sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. "Stay right where you are, Mom. I'm coming." Eleanor didn't know what he planned to do, but she felt a flicker of hope for the first time since the nightmare began. As she stood there on the busy sidewalk, still reeling from the humiliation and injustice she had faced, she couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would David be able to make things right, or had the damage already been done? Little did she know, David's arrival would set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted, a confrontation that would reveal deeper truths about prejudice, accountability, and the strength of a family's love. And so, Eleanor waited, her heart heavy, but her resolve growing stronger. This wasn't the end of her story, it was only the beginning. Underscore 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 underscore. Let me know if you'd like me to expand further or refine this. As Eleanor stood on the bustling city sidewalk, a strange mix of emotions coursed through her. Humiliation still clung to her like a heavy cloak, but there was also an undercurrent of anger simmering just beneath the surface. She replayed the events over and over in her mind, searching for a reason, a justification for why this had happened to her. But there was none. She knew she had done nothing wrong. The sting of being falsely accused wasn't just about the bracelet. It was about something deeper, something she had felt in countless small moments throughout her life, but never this blatantly. Passers-by gave her fleeting glances as they walked by, some curious, others indifferent. A few seemed to sense something was wrong but kept moving, unwilling to get involved. Eleanor clutched her bag tightly, as if holding onto it could somehow steady her. She tried to focus on her breathing, grounding herself, but her thoughts were a whirlwind. The grand hotel doors behind her had closed, but she could still feel the weight of their rejection, their dismissal of her as though she were nothing more than a problem to be dealt with and discarded. She thought about David. Her son had always been her anchor, ever since he was a boy. Even as a child, he had a way of noticing when something wasn't right and stepping in to fix it. Eleanor smiled faintly through her tears, remembering the time David had stood up to a neighborhood bully who had been picking on one of the younger kids. He had been fearless, even then, standing his ground with a quiet strength that made people stop and listen. Now, as a grown man, that strength had only deepened. She didn't know what he planned to do when he arrived, but she trusted him completely. The minutes felt like hours as she waited, leaning against a lamppost for support. Her legs were tired, not just from standing but from the emotional toll of the day. She glanced at her watch, the small silver one David had gifted her on her last birthday. It was nearly half an hour since she called him, but she knew he'd be there soon. David never broke a promise, especially not to her. Eleanor's mind wandered back to the hotel, to the accusing faces of the security guards. Their voices had been sharp, their words cutting, but what hurt them most was the assumption, the automatic leap to blame her without evidence, without even a second thought. She had lived long enough to recognize the undertones in their accusations. It wasn't just about a missing bracelet. It was about the way they saw her, the stereotypes they clung to. She had dealt with it in subtle ways throughout her life, but this time, it was as blatant as it was painful. She remembered the faces of the other guests too, how they had stared, some with pity, others with silent judgment. Not one of them had stepped in, not one had questioned what was happening. The weight of their inaction pressed down on her almost as heavily as the guard's rough hands on her arms. She couldn't shake the feeling that they had all decided, in that moment, that she was guilty simply because of who she was. A car horn blared in the distance, pulling Eleanor from her thoughts. She looked up and saw a familiar black sedan weaving through traffic. Relief washed over her as the car pulled to the curb and David stepped out. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his presence commanding even in the chaos of the city's streets. Dressed in a crisp shirt and dark slacks, he looked every bit the professional he was, but there was an intensity in his eyes that told Eleanor he was ready for a fight. "Mom," David said, his voice steady but tinged with concern. He closed the distance between them in a few strides and gently took her hands. "Are you okay?" Eleanor nodded, though her voice betrayed her as she spoke. "I'm fine, David. Just shaken up, that's all." David's jaw tightened as he glanced at the hotel behind her, the grandeur of its facade a sharp contrast to the ugliness of what had just happened inside. "Tell me everything," he said, his tone low but firm. Eleanor recounted the events as best she could, her voice trembling at times, but growing steadier with each word. She told him about the suspicious glances, the sudden accusations, the way the guards had treated her as though she were a criminal. David listened intently, his expression unreadable, but Eleanor could see the fire in his eyes. He didn't interrupt, letting her get it all out, but when she finished, he took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, as if trying to contain the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "They had no right," David said finally, his voice calm, but laced with a quiet fury. "No evidence, no proof, and they treated you like that. Unacceptable." Eleanor reached out and touched his arm. "David, I don't want to make a scene. I just want to go home." But David shook his head. "This isn't just about today, Mom. It's about the principle. They can't treat people like this and get away with it. They need to be held accountable." Eleanor hesitated. She admired her son's determination, but she worried about where it might lead. Still, a part of her agreed with him. If she walked away now, what was to stop this from happening to someone else? David glanced at the hotel again, his mind clearly working through a plan. "Stay here for a minute," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "I'll handle this." Before Eleanor could protest, he was already striding toward the hotel entrance. She watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure what he planned to do, but she knew David well enough to trust that he wouldn't back down. Inside the hotel, the atmosphere was just as opulent as Eleanor had described, but David paid no attention to the glittering chandeliers or the polished marble floors. His focus was solely on the staff at the front desk, who looked up in surprise as he approached. David didn't raise his voice, but there was a sharpness to his words that demanded attention. "I need to speak to the manager," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The receptionist hesitated, glancing nervously at a colleague before nodding. "One moment, sir," she said, disappearing into a back room. David stood there, his posture calm but unyielding. He could feel the eyes of other guests on him, but he didn't care. This wasn't about them. It was about justice, for his mother, for anyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of preconceived notions or unchecked bias. When the manager finally appeared, David wasted no time. He introduced himself calmly, explained what had happened to his mother, and demanded an explanation. The manager, a middle-aged man with a carefully polished demeanor, looked taken aback but quickly tried to regain his composure. "Sir, I assure you, we take these matters very seriously," the manager began, his tone dripping with rehearsed politeness. "If there's been any misunderstanding..." David cut him off. "This wasn't a misunderstanding. Your staff humiliated my mother without a shred of evidence. I want to know why." The manager opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, David added, "And I want to see the security footage from the gift shop. If you're so certain she did something wrong, let's see the proof." The tension in the room was palpable as the manager hesitated, clearly unsure of how to proceed. David crossed his arms, his expression unwavering. Eleanor, standing just outside the glass doors, could see the exchange happening but couldn't hear the words. Her heart raced as she watched her son hold his ground, her emotions a mix of pride and nervous anticipation. What would the footage reveal? Would it exonerate her completely, or would the hotel find some way to twist the narrative even further? Eleanor didn't know, but one thing was certain: David wasn't going to let this go. The manager's hesitation was enough to deepen David's resolve. There was no reason to hesitate if they were confident in their accusations. David's firm stare bore into the man, silently demanding accountability. The other staff behind the desk looked uncomfortable, casting uneasy glances between the manager and the determined man standing before them. It was clear they hadn't expected this level of pushback. Eleanor remained outside, her fingers nervously gripping the strap of her bag. She could see David's commanding presence even from the distance, his body language conveying both confidence and frustration. She felt a mix of emotions: gratitude for his unwavering support and a pang of worry about how far this might go. She didn't want things to escalate, but she also didn't want to let this injustice fade away without consequences. Inside, the manager cleared his throat, finally breaking the tense silence. "I'll arrange for the footage to be reviewed," he said, his tone cautious. "But I must stress that our staff was acting in accordance with protocol. When an item goes missing, we have to address it promptly." David didn't flinch. "Protocol doesn't include dragging an innocent woman out of your hotel in front of everyone," he shot back. "Your staff didn't ask questions. They didn't investigate. They assumed, and that assumption was based on prejudice." The manager's polite facade faltered for a moment, but he quickly composed himself. "I understand your frustration, sir. Please allow us a few moments to review the footage. We'll be able to clear this matter up soon." David nodded but didn't move. "I'm not going anywhere until this is resolved." As the manager retreated to a back office with a security guard, David turned to glance at the lobby. The Graham space was buzzing with activity, well-dressed guests chatting in clusters, staff bustling to and fro, but he noticed the lingering stares from a few onlookers. Some quickly averted their gazes when they caught his eye, while others seemed unapologetically curious, as though waiting to see how the situation would unfold. David clenched his fists at his sides. He wasn't here to put on a show, but he wouldn't let anyone forget what had happened. His mother's dignity had been trampled, and he wouldn't rest until she received the apology and justice she deserved. Outside, Eleanor shifted her weight from one foot to the other, trying to calm her nerves. She felt exposed standing there, her mind replaying the events of the day. The humiliation of being accused, the rough hands of the security guards, the stares of strangers, it all weighed on her like a heavy burden. But she also felt a flicker of hope. David had always been her protector, her fierce advocate. If anyone could make this right, it was him. Back in the hotel, the manager returned after what felt like an eternity. His expression was carefully neutral, but David could sense the unease behind his composed exterior. "We've reviewed the footage," the manager began, his voice measured. "It appears there was no evidence to suggest that your mother was involved in the theft." David's jaw tightened. "So you dragged her out of here, humiliated her, and accused her of stealing, all without evidence." The manager hesitated, clearly searching for the right words. "Our staff acted based on the information they had at the time. The bracelet was reported missing, and they assumed it was her," David interjected, his voice rising slightly. "Not because of any evidence, but because of their own biases. This isn't just about a missing bracelet. It's about how you treat people." The manager looked increasingly uncomfortable, glancing around as though hoping for backup from someone else. But there was no one to deflect to. This was his mess to handle. "We sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding," he said finally. "We'll be reaching out to the guest who reported the theft to clarify the situation further." David crossed his arms, his expression unwavering. "An apology isn't enough. My mother deserves more than that. She deserves accountability. How do you plan to ensure this doesn't happen to someone else?" The manager faltered, clearly unprepared for the question. "We'll review our procedures and provide additional training to our staff," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. David shook his head, his frustration evident. "That's not good enough. My mother's reputation was dragged through the mud because of your staff's actions. She was treated like a criminal in front of everyone in your hotel. Do you have any idea how humiliating that is?" Eleanor watched from outside, her heart aching as she saw David's intensity. She knew he was fighting for her, but the emotional weight of the situation was overwhelming. She wanted to walk in, to tell him it was okay, that they could just leave and move on. But she also knew that David was right. This wasn't just about her. It was about making sure no one else had to go through the same ordeal. As the conversation continued inside, a new figure approached Eleanor on the sidewalk. A woman, likely in her late 30s, with a kind face and an apologetic expression. She wore a simple yet elegant dress and carried a small clutch in her hand. "Excuse me," the woman said softly. "I couldn't help but notice what happened earlier. Are you all right?" Eleanor was taken aback by the stranger's kindness, but nodded cautiously. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. The woman smiled sympathetically. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that. It was unfair, and it shouldn't have happened. If there's anything I can do to help, please let me know." Eleanor studied the woman's face, searching for any hint of insincerity, but found none. Her words seemed genuine, and for the first time that day, Eleanor felt a small glimmer of hope that not everyone would turn a blind eye to injustice. "Thank you," Eleanor said quietly, her voice tinged with gratitude. The woman hesitated for a moment before adding, "If you're planning to take this further, I'd be happy to back you up. I saw what happened, and it was wrong. No one should be treated that way." Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. She hadn't expected anyone to come forward, let alone offer to help. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to her. Inside, David was still locked in a tense standoff with the manager, but the arrival of a potential ally outside was a reminder that sometimes, even in the darkest moments, there were people willing to stand up for what was right. The story was far from over, and the fight for justice had only just begun. David wasn't about to let the hotel off the hook, and now, with the possibility of witnesses stepping forward, the path ahead seemed a little brighter, even if it was still uncertain. David's patience was wearing thin. The manager's attempts to smooth things over felt hollow, like someone trying to slap a bandage on a wound that clearly needed stitches. David could feel the weight of his mother's humiliation pressing on him, and he wasn't about to let it slide. His voice remained steady, but there was an edge to it now, one that demanded action, not excuses. "You're saying you'll review procedures and offer training, but that doesn't change the fact that my mother was publicly humiliated today. She was judged before anyone bothered to ask a single question. How is that acceptable?" The manager shifted uncomfortably, clearly feeling the pressure of David's words. The other staff members nearby seemed to shrink back, avoiding eye contact. The tension in the air was palpable, and the stares from a few lingering guests only added to the pressure. "We'll issue a formal apology to your mother," the manager finally said, his tone slightly more resolute, as if he hoped this concession would be enough. "And we'll waive any fees associated with her stay, should she choose to remain with us." David's brow furrowed in disbelief. "An apology and a waived fee? You think that undoes what's been done? Do you think that erases the memory of being dragged out of your hotel in front of everyone, accused of something she didn't do?" His voice rose slightly, his frustration seeping through. Eleanor, standing just outside the entrance, felt her chest tighten as she listened. She wanted to intervene, to tell David it was okay, that they could let it go. But deep down she knew he was right. What had happened to her wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a symptom of a much larger problem. And David wasn't just fighting for her, he was fighting for everyone who had ever been judged unfairly. The manager seemed at a loss, his usual composed demeanor faltering under David's relentless questioning. But before he could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps drew everyone's attention. A security guard appeared, holding a small tablet in his hands. "Sir," he said to the manager, his voice low and urgent, "you're going to want to see this." The manager glanced at the guard, clearly uneasy, before turning back to David. "If you'll excuse me for just a moment." "No," David interrupted, his voice firm. "If it's about this situation, I'm staying right here. No more secrecy, no more excuses. We're getting to the bottom of this, and we're doing it now." The security guard hesitated, glancing between the manager and David, before handing over the tablet. The manager reluctantly took it and began reviewing the footage. David stood his ground, his arms crossed, his gaze unwavering. Eleanor, still outside, noticed the woman who had approached her earlier lingering nearby. The woman gave her a small, encouraging smile, and Eleanor felt a flicker of strength she hadn't felt in hours. Maybe, just maybe, things were about to turn around. Inside, the manager's expression darkened as he watched the footage. The faint sound of the video's audio could be heard, though it was difficult to make out the words. David's eyes narrowed as he tried to gauge the manager's reaction. "What is it?" David demanded. "What does the footage show?" The manager looked up, his face pale. He hesitated for a moment, clearly debating what to say, before finally speaking. "It appears that the bracelet was misplaced," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. David's jaw tightened. "Misplaced, that's what you're calling this? After everything my mother was put through, you're telling me the bracelet wasn't stolen at all?" The manager nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "It seems the guest who reported it missing left it in another room. It was found just a short while ago by housekeeping." David stared at him, his disbelief turning into anger. "So not only was my mother accused without evidence, but there wasn't even a theft in the first place. You allowed your staff to drag her out of here, humiliate her, and treat her like a criminal, all for nothing." The room fell silent, the weight of David's words hanging heavily in the air. The manager looked utterly defeated, his usual polished demeanor shattered. Outside, Eleanor watched as a few more guests gathered near the entrance, their curiosity piqued by the escalating situation. She could feel their eyes on her, their whispers carrying just far enough for her to catch snippets of their conversations. "Isn't that the woman they accused earlier?" one guest murmured. "I can't believe they just threw her out like that," another said. Eleanor's cheeks flushed with a mix of embarrassment and anger. She didn't want to be the center of attention, but she also knew she couldn't let this moment pass without standing up for herself. Back inside, David took a step closer to the manager, his voice low but firm. "This isn't just about an apology anymore. My mother deserves more than that. She deserves to have her dignity restored. She deserves to be treated with the respect she was denied. And she deserves to know that this will never happen to anyone else." The manager swallowed hard, clearly struggling to find the right words. Before he could respond, the woman who had spoken to Eleanor earlier stepped into the lobby, her presence commanding immediate attention. "I saw what happened," the woman said, her voice calm but resolute. "I watched as this woman was dragged out of the hotel without so much as a chance to defend herself. It was wrong, and everyone here knows it." The crowd that had gathered murmured in agreement, their whispers growing louder. David turned to the woman, his expression one of gratitude and respect. Her willingness to speak up meant more than he could put into words. As the tension in the room reached its peak, the manager seemed to crumble under the weight of the mounting pressure. But the conflict was far from over, and the fight for justice was still building to its ultimate crescendo. The air in the lobby was thick with tension as the woman's words settled over the crowd. For a brief moment, it felt as though justice might prevail, that Eleanor's humiliation might finally be addressed and corrected. But just as David was about to press further, a commotion at the far end of the room drew everyone's attention. A man in an expensive suit, his demeanor exuding authority, strode into the lobby. His expression was sharp, his presence commanding immediate respect. It was clear from the way the staff reacted. standing straighter, eyes darting nervously, that this was someone important. The general manager, perhaps, or even the owner of the hotel. The man wasted no time, approaching the scene with an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the gathered crowd, the distraught Eleanor still standing outside the doors, and the visibly shaken manager holding the tablet. When he spoke, his voice was firm and authoritative. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone making it clear that he expected a concise answer. The manager hesitated, clearly unsure of how to explain the situation without implicating himself further. David, however, had no such reservations. "What's going on," David said, stepping forward, "is that your staff falsely accused my mother of theft, dragged her out of this hotel in front of everyone, and only now discovered that the item wasn't stolen in the first place. And now, instead of taking accountability, they're scrambling to save face." The man's eyes narrowed as he listened, his expression unreadable. He turned to the manager. "Is this true?" The manager stammered, his words tripping over each other as he tried to explain. "Sir, there was a report of a missing item, a bracelet, and, well, there was a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" David interrupted, his voice rising. "Is that what you're calling it? My mother was humiliated, treated like a criminal, and thrown out of your hotel. That's not a misunderstanding, it's discrimination." The man raised a hand, signaling for silence. He turned back to the manager, his gaze cold. "I want to see the footage," he said simply. The manager handed over the tablet, his hands trembling slightly. As the man reviewed the footage, the room fell silent once again. The only sound was the faint murmur of the video's audio, barely audible to those nearby. As the man watched, his expression darkened. When he finally looked up, there was a flicker of anger in his eyes, but it wasn't directed at David or Eleanor. "This is unacceptable," he said, his voice low but firm. "Not just the actions of the staff, but the systemic failure that allowed this to happen." For a moment, it seemed as though he might take responsibility, that he might address the wrongs that had been committed. But then he said something that caught everyone off guard. "We'll make this right," he continued, "but we need to do it quietly. The last thing this hotel needs is bad press." David's eyes widened in disbelief. "Quietly? You think this is about protecting your reputation? My mother was publicly humiliated, and you think sweeping it under the rug is the solution?" The man held David's gaze, his expression unyielding. "We'll compensate your mother for her distress," he said. "A generous settlement. But this incident cannot become a public spectacle. It's not good for anyone." David's frustration boiled over. "Not good for anyone? It's not good for your bottom line, you mean? This isn't about money. It's about accountability. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to someone else." The man's jaw tightened, his calm facade beginning to crack. Before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "You can't buy your way out of this," the woman who had spoken earlier said, stepping forward once again. "People deserve to know the truth. This isn't just about one woman. It's about how people are treated based on assumptions and prejudice. You can't hide that behind a payout." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices growing louder as the tension escalated. The man looked around, clearly realizing that the situation was spiraling out of his control. And then, just as the conflict seemed ready to boil over, a new development shifted the narrative entirely. One of the security guards, who had been quietly observing from the sidelines, stepped forward hesitantly. "There's something else," he said, his voice shaky. "I was reviewing the footage again, and there's someone on the tape who shouldn't be there." David frowned, his anger momentarily giving way to confusion. "What do you mean?" The guard swallowed nervously. "The person who reported the bracelet missing. They're seen on the footage entering a room that isn't theirs, and they're carrying the bracelet." The room erupted in gasps and murmurs as the implications of the guard's words sank in. The supposed victim of the theft wasn't a victim at all. They were the one who had caused the entire ordeal. The man in the suit turned to the guard, his expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "Are you saying this was a setup?" The guard nodded reluctantly. It looks that way. I don't know why, but it's all on the footage. David's hands clenched into fists as he processed this new revelation. His mother hadn't just been falsely accused, she had been deliberately targeted. The question was, why? Eleanor, still standing outside, felt a chill run down her spine as she watched the scene unfold. She had been through enough already, and now it seemed there was an even deeper layer to the injustice she'd have faced. The man in the suit looked visibly shaken, his confidence now replaced with uncertainty. "Get me that footage," he ordered the guard, "and find the guest who made the report. I want them brought here immediately." The stakes had just been raised, and the truth was closer than ever. But with so many unanswered questions still hanging in the air, the tension was far from resolved. As the crowd waited for the next twist in the story, the sense of anticipation was almost unbearable. The room was a pressure cooker of emotions as the security guard hastily retrieved the footage, his nervous hands fumbling with the device. All eyes were on the tablet, where the truth would soon be laid bare. David stood rigid, his breath shallow with anticipation, while Eleanor watched from the doorway, her heart heavy with exhaustion, but still beating with a quiet strength. The crowd leaned in, their curiosity now mingled with outrage and disbelief. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity, it was something far more calculated, far more sinister. The footage began to play on the large screen in the lobby, projected for everyone to see. The video showed a young woman, well-dressed, confident, walking down the hall with a missing bracelet in her hand. The timestamp revealed that this happened well after Eleanor had even left her room. Then, in a chilling twist, the woman was seen deliberately placing the bracelet on the cart of a housekeeper and walking away, her expression calm and collected. The revelation sent a ripple of shock through the crowd. "That's her," gasped the manager, recognizing the woman as one of the guests who had reported the so-called theft. But why would she do such a thing? The room buzzed with speculation as people pieced together the implications. The man in the suit, the hotel's owner, looked thunderstruck. "Who is she?" he demanded, his voice sharp. The security guard hesitated before answering, clearly aware of the weight of his words. She's the daughter of one of our board members. She's staying here as part of an extended family visit." The air in the room shifted as the gravity of the situation sank in. This wasn't just a random act of malice. It was someone with influence, someone who likely thought their connections would shield them from accountability. David's jaw tightened as he took a step forward, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "So, let me get this straight," he said, his tone laced with anger. "This woman falsely accused my mother of theft, humiliated her in front of everyone, and now you're telling me she has ties to the very people who run this place. Are you seriously going to let this slide?" The owner's face flushed with embarrassment, but before he could respond, the door to the lobby opened again. In walked the young woman from the footage, her expression one of annoyance rather than fear. It was clear she hadn't yet realized the extent to which her actions had been exposed. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice carrying a dismissive tone as she glanced around at the gathered crowd. David wasted no time confronting her. "You know exactly what's going on," he said, his voice steady but intense. "You framed my mother. You lied, and you thought you'd get away with it. But now everyone knows the truth." The woman's eyes widened for a brief moment, but she quickly masked her surprise with indifference. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, crossing her arms. "This is all just a misunderstanding." Eleanor, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. Her voice was calm, but carried a quiet power that silenced the room. "A misunderstanding," she repeated, her eyes locked on the young woman. "You watched me be dragged out of this hotel like a criminal. You stood by while I was humiliated, and now you have the audacity to call this a misunderstanding." The young woman opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the security guard played the crucial portion of the footage again. This time, the sound was turned up, and the room heard her clearly instructing the housekeeper to place the bracelet near Eleanor's belongings, her tone casual and cruel. The weight of her actions was undeniable, and the crowd erupted in gasps and whispers. The hotel owner looked pale, his composure crumbling. This is unacceptable," he stammered, turning to the young woman. "You've not only disgraced yourself, but jeopardized the reputation of this hotel and everyone who works here." The young woman's arrogance faltered, and for the first time, fear flickered in her eyes. "It was just a joke," she said weakly, as though that would somehow absolve her. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." David couldn't contain his anger any longer. "A joke," he repeated, his voice rising. "You call ruining someone's dignity and livelihood a joke. My mother deserves better than your excuses, and she deserves justice." The owner nodded, his expression grim. "You're right," he said, turning to Eleanor. "I can't undo what's been done, but I will make sure this never happens again. She will be held accountable." The young woman tried to protest, but the owner silenced her with a wave of his hand. "Pack your things," he said coldly. "You're no longer welcome here. And rest assured, your father will hear about this." As she was escorted out of the lobby, the crowd erupted into applause, a small but meaningful gesture of support for Eleanor and David. The tension in the room began to ease, but the emotional scars remained. David turned to his mother, his voice softening. "Are you okay?" he asked, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. Eleanor nodded, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I'll be okay," she said quietly, "but this isn't just about me. It's about standing up against injustice, no matter how difficult it is." The owner approached them, his expression contrite. "I know an apology isn't enough," he said, "but I want to do whatever I can to make this right. You'll receive a full refund for your stay, and I'll personally ensure this incident is addressed with our staff." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment before nodding. "What I want," she said, her voice steady, "is for you to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." As the crowd began to disperse, David and Eleanor stood together, their bond stronger than ever. But just as they were about to leave, a hotel staff member approached them, her expression hesitant. "There's something else you should know," she said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one else could hear. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened. That young woman, she's done this before." David's eyes narrowed. "What are you saying?" The staff member hesitated, then leaned in closer. "She targets people she thinks won't fight back. You're the first ones who stood up to her." David and Eleanor exchanged a glance, the weight of the revelation sinking in. The story wasn't over, not yet. But for now, they had won a battle, and they were determined to keep fighting for what was right. As the dust settled in the hotel lobby, the events of the day hung heavily in the air. Eleanor and David walked out together, their steps measured, their hearts still racing from the emotional roller coaster they had just endured. The staff member's quiet revelation about the young woman's history of targeting others lingered in their minds, adding another layer to the injustice they had faced. But for now, the immediate battle was over, and Eleanor's dignity had been reclaimed. Outside, the cool evening air greeted them like a balm, offering a moment of reprieve from the tension inside. David glanced at his mother, searching her face for any sign of how she was truly feeling. Eleanor's expression was calm, but the weight of the experience was evident in her tired eyes. She was strong, as always, but even the strongest hearts could be bruised. "Mom," David said softly, breaking the silence. "I'm so sorry this happened. If I hadn't come, if we hadn't fought back." He trailed off, the thought too unsettling to finish. Eleanor stopped walking and turned to him, her gaze steady. "David," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "you don't need to apologize for what other people chose to do. This wasn't your fault, and it wasn't mine either. But you were there when I needed you, and that's what matters." David nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He wanted to say more, but he could see that his mother needed a moment to breathe, to process everything. They decided to sit on a bench near the entrance, away from the bustle of the hotel. As they sat in silence, the first twinkling stars appeared in the night sky. Eleanor tilted her head back, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the streetlights. "You know what," she said after a while, "this isn't just about what happened to me. It's about something bigger. How often do people like me get treated like this, without anyone stepping in to say it's wrong?" David nodded, his mind replaying the moments in the lobby, the crowd that had eventually rallied behind them, the staff member who had revealed the truth. "You're right," he said. "This kind of thing happens too often, and most of the time it gets swept under the rug. But you stood up for yourself, Mom, and we made them listen." Eleanor smiled faintly, though her eyes were still distant. "We did," she agreed. "But it's not just about us. It's about making sure no one else has to go through this." David took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "We'll make sure of that," he promised. "I don't know how yet, but we'll find a way to use this experience to help others." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. They turned to see the hotel owner standing a few feet away, his expression a mixture of regret and determination. He seemed unsure of how to begin, as though he knew words alone wouldn't be enough. "I wanted to speak to you both," he said after a moment. "Privately. What happened today was inexcusable, and I take full responsibility for the actions of my staff and for the culture that allowed this to happen." David eyed him warily, but Eleanor nodded for him to continue. The owner stepped closer, his posture humble. "I've already spoken with the board," he said. "The young woman involved has been permanently banned from our hotels. But more importantly, we're implementing mandatory training for all our staff, training on bias, on how to handle conflicts, and on treating every guest with dignity." Eleanor listened carefully, her face unreadable. "That's a start," she said finally. "But training won't mean anything if it's just a checkbox on a list. You need to make sure it's real, that it changes how people think and act." The owner nodded. "You're absolutely right," he said. "And I'd like your help with that. If you're willing, I'd like to work with you on creating a program that's meaningful. Something that doesn't just look good on paper, but actually makes a difference." David was surprised by the offer, but Eleanor considered it thoughtfully. She had spent a lifetime navigating spaces where she was overlooked, underestimated, or judged. If she could use her experience to open people's eyes, maybe something good could come from all of this. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "But if I agree, it'll be on my terms. This isn't about saving your hotel's reputation. It's about doing the right thing." "Of course," the owner said quickly. "I wouldn't expect anything less." As he walked away, David turned to his mother with a newfound respect. "You're incredible, you know that," he said with a smile. Eleanor chuckled softly, shaking her head. "I'm just doing what anyone should do," she said. "But thank you, David, for being there, for believing in me." The next morning, as they prepared to leave the hotel for good, David checked his phone and found dozens of messages from people who had witnessed the events in the lobby. Some were offering support, while others were sharing their own stories of similar experiences. It was clear that Eleanor's stand had touched a nerve, sparking conversations that went far beyond the walls of the hotel. As they drove away, the sunlight streaming through the car windows, Eleanor felt a sense of peace she hadn't expected. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew she wasn't alone. With David by her side and a renewed sense of purpose, she was ready to face whatever came next. The incident at the hotel would not define her. Instead, it would serve as a catalyst for change, a reminder that even in moments of injustice, there is power in standing up, in speaking out, and in refusing to back down. And as the car disappeared into the horizon, Eleanor allowed herself a small smile, knowing that her story was far from over.